Up to now, I think we've all assumed that if the politicians and civil servants of a country can make sure that we all get richer together, the gross domestic product of the country gets more, they will have succeeded. And what this research shows is that actually, once you've passed a certain threshold of average income throughout a country, it's not the level of the total income of the country or the average per person that makes a difference, but how that's distributed. And in particular, they've shown that the more equally the money is distributed, the income is distributed between people, the better it is for the physical health and mental health and social health of that country. And that's really surprising. And it's also a very helpful message for us as we face the challenges of diminishing resources and having to cut down on our use of carbon fuels and so on. Because it says that we can actually not have to keep increasing in order to get happier and healthier. Now, the work's been done by my brother Richard Wilkinson and his co-author Kate Pickett, and they've just published a book called The Spirit Level. And it's the result of about 30 years between them of research on social epidemiology. And what they've done is shown that there is a very strong correlation between the degree of inequality in a country and the incidence of social problems. And they've tested that out on 2 test beds, one about 30 different countries among the wealthiest in the world, the countries of Europe, North America, Australia, and so on. And the other is by comparing the 50 or so states of the United States. And in each case, they've examined how these various social factors, social outcomes, correlate with the degree of inequality. And the results are quite dramatic. So that if you compare countries, you can find that in the least equal countries, the most unequal countries, the incidence of somebody having a mental illness in the last year is about 25%. In the most equal countries, it's more like less than 10%. And there are differences as big as that in such factors as how many teenage pregnancies there are, what the incidence of obesity is, what the incidence of homicide is. For example, the most equal states in the United States have about 10 murders per million people. The least equal states have about 150, a 15 times difference in murder rates from one country to another. We've set up the Equality Trust in order to try and get this knowledge out from this newly published book, and many other researchers are finding the same sort of thing. Richard and Kate made a survey of, I think, 170 different research papers. And then we hope to actually see that reflected in policy. So we think it's very important that politicians know this, know about this research and understand it, but also that everybody in the country knows, and so they can press their politicians for change and perhaps find ways to change their own lives which spread income and power out more equally, and so make us healthier and happier in the way these results would predict. But we're not happier than we were 50 years ago when we had a much smaller income. And I think the present economic chaos has provided fertile ground for rethinking. I think there are a number of people who are saying our society is in some way damaged or inadequate and who are unhappy and perhaps ready to rethink. But I think it will be very difficult to change people's attitudes, and I think we need to show examples. I was watching a film the other day which showed people in Canada not locking their doors, whereas in America they did lock their doors, and that wasn't very far away. I think we could look for good examples, because what the results show is not that you need to have some perfect society with perfect equality of income in order to make a big difference, but that actual practical states, either states in the United States or countries such as Sweden, Japan, which are capitalist countries like the rest, have a very different experience of their relations between people and the incidence of crime and the incidence of various kinds of mental and physical ill health. Britain is usually among the 3 or 4 worst. The United States is the most unequal and has the highest incidence of many problems. Portugal comes out rather badly, and the United States, and Britain are the worst of the European countries. At the other end of the scale, it's always the same few countries that crop up, Japan and Sweden and Norway. The interesting thing is that among the, as it were, virtuous countries, the more equal, you find quite different kinds of society, the Nordic countries on the one hand and Japan on the other, and they have different politics and different cultures. And similarly, the unequal countries, the United States is not the same sort of country as Portugal. What I do know is that the degree of inequality in Britain has varied a lot, and sometimes sharply. In the 1980s and early 1990s, particularly the 1980s, inequality increased quite sharply. So taking 1975 as 100, the inequality went up to 140 by about 1990. And since then, in spite of various efforts to relieve poverty and so on, the degree of inequality has not changed very much. It might be worth talking about a time when inequality decreased very much, equality increased, and that was during the Second World War. For a long time, epidemiologists have known the example of the Second World War as an apparent anomaly, because life expectancy in Britain increased faster in the Second World War than in any other part of the last century. And that coincided, at first they thought perhaps that was due to rationing or something like that, but many people, and Richard and Kate among them, now believe that that was because there was a deliberately created greater equality. Everybody got employment. The wages of the lower paid were increased. Taxes on the rich were very much increased as well, so people were brought together. They were also brought together by the experience of having the same rationing, and there was an ideological move towards greater equality, because it was very important to convince everybody that they were all necessary and all needed for the war effort. And that, in spite of the horrors of the Second World War and people going away and families separated and bombing and so on, in many ways it was a time of great health. And I think it's interesting that in 1941, within a couple of years of the start of the war, the Beveridge Inquiry and Report was set up, which produced a great deal of our move towards treating one another equally, making provision for everyone. And that's quite astonishing if you think of the class situation in the 1930s and the fact that we were at war. You think they might have had time to think about such apparently idealistic things. But I think thinking and how we feel about one another and economic change go together and reinforce one another, and that was at a time when, under the pressure of war, those things happened very sharply. I think you could say there is a pressure from our need to stop destroying the environment, and that it doesn't quite put us on a war footing, but it may make us question very strongly the assumptions that we've been making so far, and the assumption of growth in particular. The book also says a good deal about a mechanism that explains why we are so sensitive to inequality. Most importantly, people are sensitive to what they believe other people think of them, whether their status is respected, whether they are respected as people. And if people feel that they are despised or they're failing in other people's eyes, then that is extremely stressful. And there are experiments which you can do to give people tests, and they find doing tests difficult. But if they feel they're being watched and judged by other people on the results of those tests, then their levels of stress increase enormously. Now, in our society as it is, our rather anonymous societies, we don't know one another very well, so we tend to judge one another by external and economic factors. So the kid has to wear the right trainers to school or carry the right mobile phone, and when we get older, we feel judged by the age and the size of the car we have, or what a nice house we have, or how far and how exotic our holidays can be. Now, if we feel we're failing in relation to other people in those ways, that produces stress. And it's quite measurable. You can measure the blood chemistry of people at different stages in a hierarchy. For example, in the famous Whitehall study done in a London government ministry. And you find that at each level, lower down at the hierarchy, in a given building, in a given ministry, the people show more signs of stress, their blood chemistry is less satisfactory, and they have higher rates of heart disease, such that the people at the bottom of the pile, as it were, have 4 times the incidence of heart disease of the people at the top. Now, in more unequal countries, the slope, as it were, is steeper. The perils of being lower down the slope are greater. The fears of falling down the slope are higher.